The Renaissance takes place through the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe and marks a resurgence in the value of art, which had largely subsided through the Middle Ages. New techniques developed to make art more realistic, and much of art up until the mid-20th century is based off of styles and rules established in the Renaissance. It began in Italy, but quickly spread through Northern Europe and into England, becoming the dominant style. The Sistine Chapel is one of the largest testaments of styles and themes of Renaissance art, and is decorated by numerous prominent Italian artists. Perugino shows the establishment of linear perspective and balance, and once this is achieved, opens the gateway to much more complex art. So we know we looked at this image in the very first week of class when we were talking about the formal elements, but we have a pretty complex image here that is largely based around the existence of a central line and a horizon. Da Vinci's Last Supper demonstrates the popularity of Christian imagery in Renaissance art, while the Mona Lisa also shows the complexity and application of the techniques to non-religious subject matter. Raphael's School of Athens shows an ongoing interest in Greek revival as Renaissance artists considered the ancient Greeks the last high point in art. It also shows a renewed passion for humanism, which emphasizes the accomplishment of man. Rather than showing concern for the afterlife, as was popular in the Middle Ages, Renaissance artists focused on earthly life, noting that man could achieve great things. The Greeks appeared as confirmation of this, talking about philosophy and the great thinkers of the Greek period. The emphasis on humanism was visible in Michelangelo's version of the David. If compared with the earlier version by Verrocchio, which shows a young boy and includes clues to the original story, Michelangelo's version shows an adult man and removes the context, emphasizing his humanity over his connection to the Bible. Michelangelo's contributions to the Sistine Chapel are some of the best known. He did the altar wall with an image of the Last Judgment, as well as the ceiling, which walks through the story of the creation. So you can see here, the entire Sistine Chapel is decorated. So we have the altar wall here by Michelangelo, the ceiling by Michelangelo, and then the images by other artists such as Perugino are along the walls here at the base. This shows the entire ceiling, start to finish, essentially the story of the creation. The creation of Adam emphasizes both God's divinity, but also his connection to man as sort of creator of mankind. So we see God sort of up in the heavens here, holding around him Eve, as well as surrounded by various cherubim and seraphim, and then Adam already created on earth. And they have this moment of tension where their fingers are just not quite touching. You don't know if it's just the moment after Adam has been given life or the moment just before. But there's also this emphasis on humankind. The background here around God is the cross-section of a brain. And if you broke it down and scientifically compared it to an image of the brain, you would see that he sort of anatomically gets it as correct as possible. With images like the expulsion, we again see the folly of mankind, but he is then later redeemed in the following up images of the panels that Michelangelo paints. Titian is another of the Italian masters who focuses on really the beauty of the human figure and uses Greek stories in a contemporary setting. So here we see Venus as an exquisite figure, and she's shown as a human figure rather than as divine. We see her located somewhere on Earth in contemporary Italy at the time. We see women in the background who may or may not be aware she's there. We see symbolism that lets us know she's the goddess of love. So a dog is often included as a symbol of love. But she is not essentially any other ways represented as a god. She is a human with a beautiful figure, sort of the idealized figure, but her humanity is emphasized here over her godliness. In Northern Europe, the emphasis was much more heavily on religion, but also focused on daily life. So because we're talking about the Protestant church here versus the Catholic church, there is a different perspective on where religion plays into daily life. Books of Hours were small prayer books carried around to assist people with daily devotions, and this version by the Limburg brothers is particularly exquisite. It shows the various seasons and how daily life is affected by both the wealthy and the working class. So here we see, this is February, And this is January. February shows us the working class. January shows us the wealthy. Here we have June, again, the working class. April, the wealthy. And you see the astrological signs up above. Northern Renaissance art tends to be much more meticulous than Italian styles, and also has a much bolder color palette with fewer pastels. Robert Campion's Marode altarpiece shows the Annunciation with Mary in the center. So you can see Mary seated on the floor and the angel coming to visit her. With her husband Joseph in the right panel, so Joseph the carpenter working in his shop. And then on the far left are the donors of the painting who would have actually paid for it. And their inclusion really elevates their status by having them just to the left of the Virgin. They're essentially giving themselves proximity to the Virgin and emphasizing their own godliness. The image is layered with symbolism, including white lilies for virginity, a recently extinguished candle, which emphasizes that the Virgin is no longer a virgin, and then this tiny little image of Christ on the cross, which we have seen before with our look at Giotto. And he is sort of being sent down on rays from heaven, if we go back, directly down to the Virgin's womb. We also see a contemporary Northern European city in the background, placing this image not in a nondescript biblical period, but in modern day Europe. Portraits were common subject matter in Northern Europe, and the Arnolfini double portrait is a fantastic example of this. It's a very rich and wealthy painting, and the wealth of the patrons, Arnolfini and his wife, are demonstrated through a lot of the elements in the picture. So for example, Arnolfini was a fur trader, so he is shown in these very expensive furs. His wife, an heiress, is shown in these very, very rich, heavy fabrics. They're surrounded by things like oriental rugs in the background, rich hangings, beautiful chandeliers. So we know that they are wealthy. We also see them holding hands, which is a sign of their betrothal. And we also see the artist Jan van Eyck playing with perspective. So in the background, there is this mirror. It's a convex mirror that shows both Arnolfini and his wife again, but also two additional figures in the background. So we know that the red figure, the figure with the red hat, is Van Eyck himself, and then an additional figure who might have been a witness to the marriage ceremony, some additional thing like that. And it's a way of essentially Van Eyck inserting himself into the image, kind of raising up his own prominence. He also signed, or he rather tagged the image up above into something that reads essentially, Jan van Eyck was here. Altarpieces were some of the most prominent images in Northern Europe as the Protestant faith really discouraged church decoration. So whereas in Italy we have the Sistine Chapel where every inch of the chapel is covered with religious imagery, instead in Northern Europe we get altarpieces that stand on the altar at the front of the church and are used to help aid with devotion. So the Ghent altarpiece is one of the most elaborate examples of this, with images in 3 different views. The front includes wooden carvings. So we have the right and left hand of God. We have images of Christ and his disciples down below, and then also painted images on either side. And if you open it up to the first view, we have the crucifixion. We also have the resurrection down below. And then a third image that shows the Annunciation, the birth of the birth of Christ, etc., but still shows the resurrection down below. Different views would be displayed depending on the time of year and the religious calendar. So essentially this gave them many different ways of assisting with the biblical stories that the priests might be telling without specifically having church decoration all around them. Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights is another really elaborate example of an altarpiece, though it really doesn't fit the traditional mold of what an altarpiece looks like. The outside panel is painted in something called grisaille, or grayscale, and shows a view of Earth from space. You can also see a little image of God up above looking down on the Earth. Inside there are 3 panels, so it's called triptych. If there are 3 panels, it's a triptych. 2, it's a diptych. More than 3, it is called a polytych. So the Ghent altarpiece is a polytych. So the images on the inside, the 3 panels, show the temptation on the left. So you see the Garden of Eden, you see Adam and Eve with God, and then you see these little images tempting them. In the center, we have the fall. So we see kind of chaos. There is a lot of really lewd behavior happening, man gone wild, elements of paganism with ritual with animals. It essentially sort of forgets morality. And then on the far right, we have the Last Judgment, where pretty much everyone is going to end up in hell. There are particularly terrible styles of torture that happen as you move further and further back. So at the front, people still seem to be relatively unaware of what's going to happen to them. And as you get further back, you end up in the actual fire pits of hell here. Although there is a little bit of light in the background, which perhaps indicates that some people do end up in heaven with God at the end. But essentially, the story is telling us that mankind is doomed, which is not quite the happy perspective of humanity that we get from the Italians at the same time. There is definitely a darker perspective in Northern Renaissance art. Albrecht Dürer was one of the top printmakers of the Renaissance and created an entire series of images to bring biblical stories to life. The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse uses sharp detail to depict the coming of the end of mankind. So again, if you notice this theme of doom and gloom in Northern art, it's because Northern Protestants placed a much greater emphasis on the sin of man over man's exceptionalism, which is what we see with Renaissance humanism in Italy.